Sometimes the deepest betrayals aren't loud or dramatic. They're quiet, invisible, and rooted in the truth we kept avoiding, that we were the only one who ever truly loved. Welcome to Broken Truth, where love meets lies, and every story reveals the pain behind the smile. When love is one-sided from the beginning, betrayal often comes disguised as indifference. It's not always about lies or cheating. Sometimes it's the cold ache of realizing that while you were pouring your soul out, they were simply standing there, letting you. People betray in one-sided love not because they are cruel, but because they were never in it to begin with. They accept your love, benefit from it, maybe even enjoy the comfort, but their heart never truly commits. And when they leave or replace you without guilt, it shatters not because they changed, but because you finally accept they were never really there. He never really said, "I love you" first. And I used to convince myself that love didn't need to be declared, only shown, that maybe he was the kind of person who expressed care in quieter ways, like remembering how I take my coffee or resting his hand on my back in crowded rooms. I collected these moments like proof. Tiny tokens I held up against the silence, but the truth is, silence isn't always soft. Sometimes it's sharp, a blade that cuts slow, each day a little deeper, until you're too used to bleeding to notice. I remember the way I would talk to him, with that kind of hope only lovers carry, telling him about my day in too much detail, expecting laughter or even a sigh, but his eyes always stayed somewhere else, on his phone, on the TV, on anything but me. And still, I would keep talking, as if the right story might make him stay longer in the room, as if my voice could stitch a bridge between our hearts. Even when his felt like a distant shore I couldn't reach, it wasn't that he was cruel. That would have been easier. He was polite, present in the way people are when they're physically there but spiritually checked out. He'd nod, smile, say, "That's nice." And in those two words, "that's nice," entire parts of me withered. Because I wasn't trying to be nice, I was trying to be seen. I kept giving my time, my softness, my forgiveness. I kept writing long texts he'd reply to with emojis or short one-liners. I remember one night, I told him I missed him, and he replied with awe. That was it, just awe. Like I was a child who had drawn a clumsy picture and handed it over, hoping it would be pinned to a fridge. I used to scroll back through our conversations late at night, looking for warmth, anything that said, "I care," or "I think of you too," but they were all me. Paragraphs in blue, lines in gray, like some invisible imbalance I kept trying not to see. He never asked about my dreams, never held my face in his hands and said, "I'm glad it's you." Not once. I knew. His coffee order, his mother's birthday, the name of the street he grew up on. But he didn't even know I hated thunderstorms, that they reminded me of childhood fights and broken windows. He once joked about how I cried during a movie. I laughed along, but I felt my heart clench because that was the first time I had cried in front of someone since my father died, and it didn't matter to him. The worst kind of loneliness is the one that lives inside a relationship, where you're sharing a bed but not a life, where your laughter echoes in a room he never truly enters. I used to lie awake beside him, memorizing the sound of his breathing just to feel closer. He'd fall asleep with ease, I'd stay up with questions, always the same ones. Is this what love feels like? Or am I just hoping it is? I started shrinking to fit his silences. I didn't ask too many questions, didn't tell him when he hurt me. I convinced myself not to be too much, not too emotional, not too needy. I became this quiet version of myself, just hoping that maybe if I was easier to love, he might start loving me back. And the hardest part? He never left. He stayed in that half-present, half-gone way. He didn't break up with me. He didn't cheat. He just existed, beside me, but not with me. And because he stayed, I told myself it meant something, that maybe love wasn't fireworks, but quiet comfort. I ignored the ache. I ignored how I was always the one reaching, always the one initiating, always the one hoping. I remember our anniversary. I bought him a book he once mentioned in passing, wrapped it with shaky hands, added a note that said, "Thank you for choosing me every day." He gave me a keychain, no note, no smile that reached his eyes. And I remember standing in the bathroom that night, looking at myself in the mirror, wondering if maybe love was supposed to feel like this, a constant effort to earn what should be given. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It was in the way he forgot to ask how my presentation went, and the way he didn't notice when I stopped wearing perfume, and the way he replied, "Okay," when I finally said, "I don't feel loved. Not what do you mean?" Not "I'm sorry," just "Okay." And I think that was the moment I broke, not from anger, not from betrayal in the usual sense, but from the realization that I had been writing poetry in a language he never cared to learn. I started pulling back after that, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. I stopped texting first. Stopped telling him when something beautiful reminded me of him. Stopped waiting for him to look at me the way I had always looked at him. And the silence between us didn't grow. It simply became more visible. I looked back at the beginning, as people do when they need answers, and I saw it then, so clearly, the way he never really chased me, the way I always made the plans, the way he never said he missed me first. It was all there, signs I had dressed up as shyness or emotional unavailability or past trauma. But maybe the simplest explanation was the truest. He didn't love me not the way I loved him, not with fire or depth or even genuine care. Maybe he liked me. Maybe he liked the way I loved him, but he never chose me. Not really. He just let me stay. The way some people let the TV run in the background while they scroll through their phone. And that's what hurt the most, not the absence of love, but the presence of my own, echoing in empty rooms. I didn't leave dramatically. I didn't scream or demand closure. I simply stopped fighting to be enough for someone who never tried. I walked away slowly, the way people do when they realize the house they built was always missing a foundation. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, I found my answer. Love wasn't supposed to feel like begging. It wasn't supposed to feel like waiting in a room where no one ever comes. It wasn't supposed to make you feel smaller. I stopped blaming him and started grieving the part of me that thought love meant holding on. But real love, it never asks you to prove your worth. It sees you, chooses you every day. And now I wait for that kind of love, even if it means being alone a little longer, at least this time. I'll be alone, not lonely in someone else's silence. They stop checking their phone, not in a dramatic act of strength, but because one day it just became too exhausting to wait for a message that had long been replaced with silence. The read receipts, the typing dots that never appeared, the hope that flickered every time the screen lit up. It all started to feel like dragging themselves through mud for a breadcrumb of affection. And so they let go, not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but like someone quietly loosening their grip on something that's already floating away. At first, the days felt hollow, not because they missed him, but because their routines had been so wrapped around the idea of being seen. Sending photos of sunsets, little updates, checking in just to feel close. They had turned their love into a service. And now, without the recipient, the gestures floated in limbo. They had to learn how to pour that energy back inward. And that wasn't easy. They began small. Morning coffee became a ritual, no longer something shared or posted or offered, but a moment to be still, to sit in silence and ask, how am I today? What do I need? The answers didn't always come, but the question, that was new. For the first time, they started journaling, not with polished thoughts or perfect sentences, just raw feelings spilled onto paper. And as they reread their own words, something cracked open, not pain, not longing, but recognition, a quiet, aching awareness that they had been so busy proving their love that they forgot to wonder if it was mutual. They stopped apologizing for their sensitivity, the tears that used to embarrass them, the overthinking that made them spiral, the way their heart picked up too many signals. All of it, once labeled as too much, now felt like sacred data. Their sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It was a compass that had always known something was off. They had just silenced it. But not anymore. Now, when their chest tightened in conversation, they didn't shove the feeling down, they listened. When someone's energy felt cold or distracted, they didn't try harder. They stepped back. Slowly, boundaries started to form, not as walls, but as gentle fences, markers that said, this is where I end, this is what I deserve, this is what I no longer chase. They went back to places they once loved, bookstores, parks, coffee shops, not to be seen, but to be with themselves. And with every solo walk, every quiet evening reading a book instead of waiting for a reply, they realized they weren't lonely, they were healing. One day, they looked in the mirror and whispered, I don't miss him. It startled them because it was true. What they missed was the idea of being chosen, the fantasy that maybe, just maybe, their love would be enough to awaken his. But fantasy is fragile, and it had shattered. What remained was reality. They had loved someone who never met them halfway. And still, they had stayed. Now, instead of shame, they met that truth with compassion. They stayed because they wanted to believe. They stayed because they didn't yet know that love should feel safe. They stayed because the version of them back then still hoped their worth could be proven, but they're different now, not bitter, not guarded, just aware of love they now understand isn't about constant giving. It's about balance, reciprocity. It's about someone looking back at you with the same tenderness, the same urgency, and if that's not present, then walking away isn't. Loss, it's return to yourself. They started loving slowly, not just others, but themselves. They celebrated little things. The way they could finally sleep through the night, the way they no longer explained their feelings, the way their voice didn't shake when they said, this doesn't feel good to me. They started choosing people who showed up fully, who listened without distraction, who didn't make them feel like they had to earn affection through performance. And one evening, while watching the sky turn gold, they realized they were free. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled them. They didn't need closure. They didn't need revenge. They didn't even need an apology. They just needed this. To believe they are worthy of a love that doesn't require shrinking. To believe that protecting your heart doesn't mean closing it off. It means being selective with who gets to hold it. And above all, to believe this simple truth. Being alone isn't the same as being unloved, especially when you finally learn to love yourself the way you once begged someone else to. Some betrayals don't look like betrayal. They look like someone quietly not choosing you over and over again. But healing begins the moment you choose yourself. Subscribe for more stories on the raw side of love, only on Broken Truth.